Hey everybody, Brian Allred, teaching pastor at New Life Presbyterian Church in Yorktown. Welcome back to our series on learning to love Leviticus, where today we are actually entering into a new section of the book. We have finished the instructions for the purity laws in chapters 11 through 15. We wrapped that up in the last session together. And so today we're going to be looking at instructions for atonement that are found in just one chapter, Leviticus chapter 16, which happens to be a very significant chapter in the book, having to do with instructions for the Day of Atonement. Now, the Day of Atonement is one of the most significant days on Israel's calendar. It happened once a year. It was annual. The name in the Hebrew for the Day of Atonement you may have heard of is Yom Kippur. You've probably heard that term before, but may not have associated it with the Day of Atonement. But the Hebrew word for day is Yom, and the Hebrew word for atonement is Kippur. So Yom Kippur refers to this annual Day of Atonement, one of the most significant days on Israel's calendar. Now, as you know, the nation of Israel had a number of days that were significant, a number of times during the year that were to be set apart for celebration, sacred time, if you will. Actually, one day a week was set apart as sacred time. That would be the weekly Sabbath day. But you also have Passover celebration, which was a significant day for Israel. Annually, we'll read about a number of feasts that the Israelites were required to observe in Leviticus chapter 23. But here is one of, if not the most significant day on Israel's calendar, because it's a day in which the Israelites enjoyed cleansing and forgiveness for all of their sins. I mean, if you remember what we talked about in the laws for purity in chapters 11 through 15, you might think, oh, how could anyone really make sure that they hadn't accidentally become unclean by sitting on a seat that they didn't realize had become unclean because someone unclean with a discharge had been sitting on it previously, or if they had drank out of a vessel following someone who was unclean and they didn't know about it. How could they have known that? And that's a fair question. Indeed, how could they have known about it? But this annual day of cleansing, and not only cleansing, but forgiveness. If you remember, the Israelites have just received or are receiving all of these laws from Moses, or from the Lord through Moses. And how could they be sure that they hadn't violated one of them out of ignorance? We even talked about this in one of the sacrifices earlier in the book about unintentional sins committed. Well, again, that's a reasonable thing to consider, that what if somebody committed a sin that they weren't aware of and needed forgiveness? Well, this annual Day of Atonement took care of all of that for the nation as a whole and for actually the tabernacle structure. It was cleansed from its uncleanness. This annual day of cleansing and forgiveness for the people. But this cleansing and this forgiveness was not done through any kind of disinfectant cloths or bleach. It could only be done through sacrificial blood. Very important part of the Day of Atonement. On this day, the high priest made atonement for himself and his household, the tabernacle, and all the people. This comprehensive day of cleansing and forgiveness. We actually read about that toward the end of the chapter. Again, we're not taking time to read the chapter as part of the video lessons, so I encourage all of you who are watching this to make sure that you spend some time actually reading through the chapters along with the lessons. But in verse 33 of chapter 16, it's summarized this way: the high priest shall make atonement for the holy sanctuary, and he shall make atonement for the tent of meeting and for the altar. We'll say more about those three designations later: sanctuary, tent of meeting, and altar. And he shall make atonement for the priests and for all the people of the assembly. Verse 34 then goes on to say, this shall be a statute forever for you, that atonement may be made for the people of Israel once in the year because of all of their sins. So this annual day of cleansing and forgiveness for the priests, for the priest's household, for all of the tabernacle, and for all of the people as well. Very, very significant day. But remember, we said some things early on in the series about the significance of this Day of Atonement in the scope of the Pentateuch and the Scriptures as a whole. Remember, I've shared with you before this book by Michael Morales, Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord, which is a biblical theology of the book of Leviticus. And Morales makes a compelling argument about the central place that Leviticus plays in the Pentateuch, which, remember, has to do with the first 5 books of the Bible. Penta meaning 5. These are the books of Moses: Genesis, Numbers, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They all share Mosaic authorship. That's the Pentateuch, and Leviticus is in the middle of that. And there is even a middle part to the book of Leviticus and a middle part to the Day of Atonement. We went through some of these things earlier. We talked about a chiastic structure, which is a literary device that's employed oftentimes in the scriptures, in which the middle part of the literary structure is the main point to be made. And as you move out from that center point, you often have mirrored elements. For example, the proposed literary structure of the Pentateuch that I shared a long time ago has an A at the top, but then an A prime at the bottom, and those two things mirror one another. You have a B and a B prime, Exodus and Numbers, mirroring one another in some way. And then you have the main thing at the center, Leviticus, which here happens to be worship regulations for communion with God. And of course, what's more central to that, or more central than that, to the Bible and to our relationship with the Lord, our worship of Him and our communion and fellowship and relationship with Him. That's at the center, and it happens to be at the center of the Pentateuch as well. You can see the mirroring elements of that. Genesis, separation from the nations through the selection of Abraham, covenant stipulations given, seeing the land, or at least being in the land, being removed from the land toward the end. Remember, it ends with the people of Israel in Egypt. But then Deuteronomy also has to do with separation from the nations in their holiness, covenant stipulations given again throughout the book of Deuteronomy. And of course, they're just outside the land there. In Exodus, you read about desert journeys and grumbling and plagues. Same thing is reflected in Numbers. And so get this chiastic structure of the Pentateuch with Leviticus at the middle. But Leviticus also has a center. We talked about this as well. You begin with A, instructions governing sanctuary worship with sacrifices. This is mirrored by A prime with the instructions also governing sanctuary worship, but more about the festivals. And we'll get there later. And then you have B and B prime concerning the priests, the priestly office consecrated, set apart in chapters 8 through 10. But then the holiness of the priests themselves that we'll, Lord willing, spend some time talking about in Leviticus 21 and 22. And then we have instructions that govern personal fitness. Fitness meaning here their fitness to enter into the tabernacle courtyard, meaning they're clean and they're holy. And so the instructions governing personal fitness for cleanliness, we've covered already in Leviticus 11 through 15, Leviticus 17 through 20, instructions governing personal fitness regarding holiness. And so we'll look at that in a second too. But right here in the center of the book of Leviticus, from this chiastic structure, are the instructions for the Day of Atonement. So that's where we are. But even this chapter has a center. We can look at the proposed chiastic literary structure of this specific chapter. It won't take a lot of time going through all of this because we're going to look at the contents of the book. But I would just direct your attention there to letter G with the arrow right in the middle. In the middle is atonement, verses 16 through 20 of the book. Let's read one verse there, verse 16. And thus the priest shall make atonement for the holy place because of the uncleannesses of the people of Israel and because of their transgressions, all their sins. And so there's this emphasis placed, an accent placed on atonement right in the middle of chapter 16, which is right in the middle of the book as a whole, at least thematically, structurally, from a literary perspective, right in the middle of the book, which is the book placed right in the middle of the Pentateuch. And so remember that I quoted Morales a couple of different times with his suggestion that atonement is at the very center of the Pentateuch. Leviticus is found in the middle. It's central, literally, to the Pentateuch, and atonement is found at its center. Morales writes this then. The primary theme and theology of Leviticus and of the Pentateuch as a whole is Yahweh's opening a way for humanity to dwell in the divine presence. You might remember that from earlier lessons, that this is the literary context of the book of Leviticus. The Lord opening a way for humanity to dwell in His presence, in His holiness. A dwelling that had been lost through the fall but is now being restored by God's redemptive activity and His revelation of the construction of this tabernacle. But this opening of a way is particularly through atonement, right here in the center of Leviticus. It's a theme that stretches throughout the horizon of the Pentateuch, but it's raised, find their source at its highest arc right here where we are. He also writes atonement is at the heart of the Pentateuch because atonement is the doorway to life with God. Of course, that wasn't true in the garden before the fall, but after the fall, this is very much true. Atonement is the doorway to life with God. And so we're going to see how this plays out in the book of Leviticus, but also how it's pointing forward to the ultimate sacrifice offered that brings final and complete atonement for God's people in the person and work of Jesus. So let's take a look at this Day of Atonement in Leviticus chapter 16. I would say that there are three ways that we can look at this. We see priestly preparation for the Day of Atonement, and then we see priestly ritual on the Day of Atonement, and finally priestly fulfillment of the Day of Atonement. So those would be the 3 points I would have: priestly preparation, priestly ritual, priestly fulfillment. We won't get through all of those in this lesson. But we know early on that the high priest had to humbly prepare himself before entering into the Holy of Holies. Now remember, if you think about the tabernacle construction again, remember there's an outer courtyard, and then there's a tent proper in the middle of the courtyard, and there's two parts to that tent. There's a holy place, and in that holy place you would find a menorah for light, you would find a table with bread, and you would find an altar of incense. And you would enter into that area from the courtyard through a curtain. And then there'd be another curtain, however, that housed an even more inner chamber, and that's called the most holy place. So there's the courtyard, the holy place, and then the most holy place, which is the most inner part of the tabernacle inside that tent, and that's where you would find the Ark of the Covenant that was overlaid with a sheet of gold called the mercy seat. So we talked about that in an earlier lesson as well. I don't remember which exactly lesson we talked about that in, but if you go and search some of the earlier lessons in the series, you'll be able to find a diagram of that. But the high priest had to humbly prepare himself before entering into the Holy of Holies. And this would only happen on the Day of Atonement. No other day was the high priest permitted to enter into the Holy of Holies, just on the Day of Atonement. And he did this in three ways. He had to select burnt and sin offerings. He had to actually reduce the clothing that he wore. It's stripped of most of its regalia, and all he wore was linen, a sash, and the turban. So none of that other more elaborate breastpiece and all of those other kinds of accessories that were used to clothe him in his regular priestly activities. On the Day of Atonement was much more humble in terms of the clothing that he wore into the Holy of Holies. And then he also had to bathe. He had to wash himself. So there's this preparation that has to be done. But the people also had to prepare themselves by humbling and afflicting themselves. We read about this actually right near the end of the chapter. The people aren't addressed until the end of the chapter about what their obligations on the Day of Atonement are. But this afflicting and humbling of themselves likely involved fasting and prayer, which is not uncommon for the Israelites to be instructed to have a period of time afflicting themselves or humbling themselves before a period of celebration. And actually, that's something that has existed through most of church history as well, that most Christians throughout time have connected celebrations with a prior time of proper preparation through fasting and through prayer. For example, if you think about the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic practice of Lent, that's basically a period of time of deprivation before the celebration of Easter. It's a period of fasting. Church history also showed that before the celebration of Christ's birth, there were times of fasting and afflicting ourselves. And we actually are impoverished as a contemporary church in North America that we don't make a practice of that more regularly, because it does enhance our celebration when we spend an amount of time preparing ourselves spiritually for that. Most of us can't just flip a switch and enter into this intense celebration. It just seems like it arrives and it goes and we didn't feel prepared for it. Well, you didn't feel prepared for it often because we don't spend time actually preparing for it. Now, at least we don't enter into any difficulty in preparing for those kinds of things. And so it's probably something that we should consider much more frequently and enter into the practice of those things much more frequently than we do. So there's the priestly preparation on the Day of Atonement, but as I said, there's also priestly ritual on the Day of Atonement. Of course, this is what we want to talk most about. Let me say at this point that involved in this ritual are 5 animals. If you just read Leviticus 16, it's kind of hard to keep track of what exactly is involved here because there's a repetition of the same animal mentioned again, and it's not always easy to discern is this the same animal, is this a different animal? There are 5 animals involved in the ritual on the Day of Atonement. The Lord is instructing for the people here. There is 2 animals involved for the priest and his household. There's to be a ram for a burnt offering and a young bull for a sin offering. We could also call that a purification offering. We talked about that in Leviticus chapter 4 with the sacrifices. Sin offering, purification offering, same thing. Might be more helpful to think of them, particularly when it's related to things and not people, as purification offerings, as we will see with the purification of the tabernacle. But even with the purification laws in 11 through 15, it's probably more helpful for us to think about them as purification offerings because they were used in instances that were not morally sinful. Remember, we talked about this. The sin offering is after childbirth, for instance. It's not that the condition following childbirth was a sinful condition, but it required cleansing, and it was connected to purification offerings. But in any event, there was a young bull that was selected for a sin offering for Aaron the high priest and his household. Those are 2 animals, a ram for a burnt offering, young bull for a sin offering. But for the people, there was also a ram for a burnt offering, and there were 2 goats for a sin offering. One would actually be slaughtered, and the blood would be applied in the most holy place, the holy place, and the altar. Actually, we'll look at that in a second. But there's also a second goat that would be sent away. So 2 goats and a ram for the people. That's a total of 5 animals involved in this ritual. We can also say that there are 3 parts involved in the ritual. At least this following Morales I think is helpful. There's an entrance ritual on the Day of Atonement. There's a cleansing ritual on the Day of Atonement involving the use of the blood. And then there's an elimination ritual as well, and that has to do with the goat that is sent away, the scapegoat, as it's often referred to. We probably won't get to that today, but we'll get to that in the next lesson, Lord willing. But 3 parts. Let's just look at the entrance ritual very briefly, and then the cleansing ritual, at least the first part of the cleansing ritual with the application of the blood. And so with the entrance ritual, I'm not talking about necessarily the clothing that has to be removed, and he has to be stripped down to, again, just the linen garment, the turban, and the sash. This is different. After preparing himself, we read that the high priest is to take a censer, and he's to take coals from the altar. This would likely either be the altar of incense inside the holy place, or actually the altar of burnt offering in the courtyard. To one of those places he takes coals, and he burns incense as he enters the most holy place. Now he's already actually slaughtered the sin offering, the young bull, for himself. But before he takes that into the most holy place behind the veil, he takes incense in there as well, which actually would have filled the room with a little bit of smoke so that it would obscure in some ways the fullness of God's glory dwelling there. Remember that the Lord tells Moses, when Moses asks to see his glory in Exodus chapter 32 or 33 or 34, I think it's 33 and 34, that no one can behold the Lord's glory and live. Now, of course, the fullness of God's glory is not manifested in the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, as it would be in heaven. But there is an element of the realness of his glory that is manifested there. And so Aaron is instructed to take this incense into the most holy place lest he die. And so there's this kind of smoke that obscures his complete vision as he does his ministry in the most holy place. And so Morales observes, I think helpfully, that in some way we see the high priest entering the clouds of heaven here. Remember, this is the Lord's dwelling place. Again, it's not the fullness of his dwelling place in glory as he resides in heaven, but the ark is placed in the most holy place as his footstool. And so heaven is touching earth here. God is meeting with his people here. And this is most centrally located in the tabernacle, but within the tabernacle, most centrally located in the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. And so there's these clouds here. This priest enters into the clouds of heaven, as it were, as he alone is enabled to draw nearer to the divine presence than anyone since Eden has been able to do. Remember, we talked about this with the redemptive context, that after Adam and Eve sinned, they're driven out of the garden away from the presence of the Lord. Now this question is, how do we dwell again in the presence of the Lord who gives life? We can only do that by grace. But the Lord has conveyed that grace through the instructions given to Moses for the tabernacle, the construction of this tabernacle, because he is intent to have relationship with his people, to dwell in the midst of his people, that he would be their God, they would be his people. And so he has drawn near to them. But the person who draws nearest to him is the high priest once a year, who enters into this most holy place, a kind of re-entry to Eden, coming again from the east. Remember, they're driven to the east of Eden, and now they're coming back into moving westward in an eastward direction to the most holy place. So the high priest is kind of this new Adam, if you will, but of course very different than the first Adam, because here in a fallen world and in a sinful condition, the high priest can only enter into the presence of the Lord with sacrificial blood, the sacrificial blood that the Lord is appointing. Now, if you just think about that, we can only enter into the presence of the Lord with sacrificial blood. Is that an Old Testament statement or a New Testament statement? And those of you who have heard me teach before and ask this question know that I like to answer those questions with yes. It's Old Testament, but it's also New Testament. These principles are fulfilled as we move toward completion in Christ Jesus. Remember, 3 points or 3 steps to learning to love Leviticus: understanding the context, understanding the content, and understanding the completion in the ministry of Jesus. But he can only enter with sacrificial blood. And so that brings us to the cleansing part of the priestly ritual on the Day of Atonement. So having sacrificed the bull as the sin offering or the purification offering for him and his household, the high priest is to take that blood. He's in the most holy place, and he sprinkles blood over the mercy seat and in front of it 7 times behind the curtain. If you go back and look at chapter 4, when we first talked about the sin offering, you'll see that he was to sprinkle the blood 7 times outside the curtain or outside the veil. Here, he sprinkles it 7 times behind the veil or the curtain, over the mercy seat and in front of it. And so you have this mercy seat on top of the Ark of the Covenant, overlaid with gold, and he is sprinkling it with blood. We'll have more to say about the significance of that, hopefully, in the next lesson. But he is then, after he does that, he is to take the blood of the sin offering of the people. Remember, there's a goat that's selected. There's a goat that is offered as a sin offering and a goat that's sent away. He takes the blood of that goat, and he is to do the same before the mercy seat. And then it seems that he moves outward to the most holy place, because there's or not the most holy place. He moves outward to the holy place, where it seems that this is the reference to the tent of meeting here. The tent of meeting is the whole thing, actually. But there's this 3-part language that we read in Leviticus 16. The holy place, the tent of meeting, and the altar. And it seems that, although it's not explicit in the text, he also applies some blood within the holy place where the table, the menorah, and the altar of incense are. And he makes atonement for that, cleansing for that. And then he takes the blood of both the young goat for the people's sin offering and the young bull for the sin offering of him and his household. He mixes it together and he applies it to the altar in the courtyard where the burnt offerings are offered. Remember, having that diagram might be helpful in your mind. But in verse 20 it says, to make atonement for the holy place, the tent of meeting, and the altar. There's that threefold language again. And it seems that what is being suggested there is atonement for the Holy of Holies, the holy place, and the courtyard as a whole. All of this is atoned for because of the uncleannesses and the sinfulness of the people, so that God's dwelling can be cleansed and he can remain dwelling in the midst of his people. Notice the inside-out movement of this. The cleansing starts in the innermost part of the most holy place and moves outward toward the altar in the courtyard. And so that's what happens to the goat of the sin offering, but we have not yet looked at what happens to the other goat. And so that will be what we pick up with in the next lesson. And we will also spend a little bit more time looking at how this all points forward and anticipates the work of Jesus, and how in him this annual Day of Atonement is completely fulfilled in the gospel. And so we'll look at that next week, Lord willing. Hopefully you'll join us then.